All right, here is the second podcast for Standards 2.2 and 2.3. This podcast, we're going to take a look at how we classified living things into the different domains and kingdoms. So when we look at living things, we're going to use the characteristics that we talked about in the first podcast, like cell type and cell structures and mode of nutrition, and we're going to place things into categories. So all living things are going to belong to any of these different categories. The largest and most inclusive category of classification for living things is the domain. And what we look at when we're placing things into domains is mostly similarities and differences among the DNA of organisms. So there's actually two domains of bacteria that exist, and the reason for that is their DNA sequences are very different from each other. So they're actually not very closely related. So one way we can look at how closely related things are is to look at their DNA sequences. And the more similar the sequences are, the more closely related two living things are. And because the different bacteria are very different from each other, they actually get their own big categories, even though they look very similar to each other. So three domains that we are going to talk about that exist in living things. The first is called archaea, and that is one of our domains of bacteria. The second is bacteria, and the third domain is called eukarya. So both the archaea and the bacteria domains are made of organisms of prokaryotes, and the eukarya domain is made of organisms that are eukaryotes. So we're going to talk about each of these domains and then the kingdoms that belong within each of them. So starting with the domain archaea, all members of the domain archaea are prokaryotes. Remember, that means that their cells do not have a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. They are unicellular, so they're one-celled organisms. And they have cell walls surrounding them, but that cell wall does not contain a carbohydrate protein type of thing called peptidoglycan. This is a special chemical that is found in some bacteria, but these types of bacteria, the ones that belong to the domain archaea, do not have this particular chemical in their cell walls. And that's like one of the major structural differences you can see between archaea and regular bacteria. They can be autotrophs or heterotrophs, so some can make their own food, usually through chemosynthesis. Others can consume food. And they all reproduce asexually. So they're just going to divide in half by binary fission. And in the domain archaea, there's one kingdom, and that kingdom is called Archaeobacteria. The second domain we're going to talk about is the domain bacteria. Again, they are prokaryotes, just like the archaea. They are also unicellular. But the big thing that is different here is that their cell walls do have this chemical called peptidoglycan in there, whereas, remember, the archaea do not have that. And this is something that can actually be tested for using chemicals. You can test to see if the cell wall has this particular chemical in it or not. They also can be autotrophs or heterotrophs. They reproduce asexually. And there is one kingdom under the domain bacteria, and that is the kingdom Eubacteria. And when you see this U, that means new, and whereas the archaea means old. So one thing we can think about is that these are the newer bacteria that exist, whereas the Archaeobacteria tend to be thought of as the ones that were originally on Earth, the first life forms on Earth. The third domain of living things is the domain Eukarya. Okay, so all members of the domain Eukarya are eukaryotes. They can be unicellular or multicellular. They have various cell parts and membrane-bound organelles. That is what makes them eukaryotes. They also have a nucleus on the inside of them, so these are much more complex, whereas the prokaryotic domains are very simple organisms. They can be autotrophs or heterotrophs. So some of them are going to use photosynthesis to make their own food. Others are going to consume food in various ways. They may reproduce asexually or sexually, depending on the type of organism. And so within this domain, you have four kingdoms. So we're going to break down the domain Eukarya into the kingdoms Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. So we're going to talk about each of those kingdoms now. Okay. So the next largest category of classification are the kingdoms, and there are 6 kingdoms of living things. So you have your Archaeobacteria. Remember I said archaea means ancient, so these are ancient bacteria. You have the kingdom of Eubacteria. These are your newer bacteria. And then you have the protista, the fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. And so this graphic over here gives you a quick kind of view of what they are. Like plants are multicellular eukaryotes, as are animals and fungus. Protists are also eukaryotes, but they may be unicellular or multicellular. And both the eubacteria and the archaeobacteria are unicellular and prokaryotic. So there are other differences, though, that we're going to talk about when we look at these. So we're going to start with the the kingdom Archaeobacteria. So remember, all members of this kingdom belong to the domain Archaea. Okay, so that's one of the things that we identify them as having prokaryotic cells. The kingdom Archaeobacteria, these members are called extremophiles. So the word phile means to like something. So these guys actually really like to live in extreme conditions. They can live places where there's really high temperatures or very little oxygen or no light. These are organisms that can live in places where you think living things couldn't live. They can be autotrophs or heterotrophs. If they're an autotroph, they will do chemosynthesis, so they're going to use chemicals to make their own food. And if they're heterotrophs, they typically are going to be doing decomposition. All of them are going to reproduce asexually by binary fission. And some examples that we have methanogens are an example. These are found in the human intestines. So pretty hostile environment in the human intestines if you think about it, and these kind of bacteria can survive there. They're the ones that help us to break down fiber, and they release gas in the process. So remember we talked about that whole Beano thing that we did. These are the methanogens that are causing the gas to form. Halophiles love salt, so they are able to live in ocean waters, in places where, or like the Great Salt Lake, where other things may not be able to live. Okay, now the kingdom Eubacteria, remember eu I said is the newer bacteria. Okay, all the members of the domain Eubacteria, or the kingdom Eubacteria, belong to the domain Bacteria. So again, they are prokaryotic cells. These are your more modern bacteria, the more common types of bacteria that we hear about. Some of them are disease-causing, but many of them are helpful. Many of them are things that we actually need to have around, especially in our body, to help our bodies to function correctly. Okay. They can be autotrophs. Some of them are actually able to do photosynthesis, even though they don't have chloroplasts. Some of them actually have chlorophyll inside of them, and they can do photosynthesis. Others are going to do the chemosynthesis. Some are heterotrophs. Some will do fermentation, and some will do decomposition. So we can actually use bacteria to ferment like milk and make different kinds of cheeses. Sometimes bacteria is involved in that process. They reproduce asexually, just like the Archaeobacteria, through binary fission, so they just make an exact copy of themselves. And they come in various shapes. So some of them these are called cocci, so these are the circular-shaped ones. The bacilli are rod-shaped, and the spiral-shaped ones are kind of neat-looking little things. They're called spirochetes. So they have various shapes to them that we can see. So some examples, Streptococcus, that's what causes strep throat. E. coli, that's an infection we hear about sometimes that can cause severe intestinal problems and diarrhea. So those are disease-causing ones, but there's a lot of really good bacteria out there as well that we need. Okay. The next kingdom we're going to talk about is the kingdom Protista. These guys belong to the domain Eukarya because they are made of eukaryotic cells. Some of them have cell walls that are made of cellulose. Okay, so one of the ways we can identify a protista is if it has a cell wall. Most of them are unicellular. An example of a unicellular is a protozoan. Some are multicellular. Algae and certain types of seaweed are actually in the kingdom Protista, and they are multicellular. Some of them are autotrophs, and they will do photosynthesis. Actually, most of the photosynthesis that happens on Earth happens because of protists, like algae. And some are heterotrophs, and they can do cellular respiration. They reproduce asexually by dividing. Because they're eukaryotes, that process that they're going to use is called mitosis. So it's not binary fission. They don't just like make a really quick little copy of themselves. It's a more complex process, but they are still making a copy of themselves. We tend to think of Protista as the others. Basically, any living thing that doesn't really fit into any of the other kingdoms will end up in the kingdom Protista. Things like amoeba, kelp, slime mold, these are all examples of protists. what will most likely end up happening is that this kingdom is probably going to end up getting divided into two kingdoms in the future as they learn more about them. Okay. Next kingdom we have is the fungi. Again, belongs to the domain eukarya. So they're made of eukaryotic cells. They have cell walls as well, but their cell walls are made of a carbohydrate called chitin instead of cellulose. Most of them are multicellular, like mushrooms, but you do have some that are unicellular, like mold. Yeast is another example of a fungus. They are heterotrophs. They do decomposition. So they do not have chloroplasts. They cannot make their own food. A lot of people have the misunderstanding that fungi or like mushrooms are plants. They're not. Okay, they're actually decomposers. They reproduce asexually, usually by releasing spores out into the air. And some of them actually can do a process called budding, where they actually like kind of grow a little mini one that falls off and it grows into another one. A lot of mushrooms will actually grow that way. So examples of fungi, you've got mushrooms, yeast, mold. These are all things that fall into this kingdom of fungus. And remember, the big identifying factor about them is that they have cell walls that are made of chitin. All right, the kingdom Plantae, still the domain eukarya, so they're made of those eukaryotic cells. They have cell walls that are also made of cellulose, but there's a big difference between them and the protista. They also have chloroplasts in them. The chloroplasts allow them to do cellular respiration, or not cellular respiration, sorry, photosynthesis. But the big thing that's the difference between plants and protists is that they are multicellular. Most protists are unicellular. They are autotrophs because they're going to do photosynthesis using those chloroplasts. And most plants actually reproduce sexually. Remember at the beginning of the year I told you guys that if you're allergic to pollen, that's actually plant sperm that goes out into the air and it has to get into an egg inside of a flower. So examples of the kingdom Plantae, you've got moss, trees, your various flowering plants, all of those things. Those are all plants. Okay. And finally we have our kingdom Animalia. Okay, again, domain eukarya, so they're eukaryotic cells. These guys are identifiable because they have no cell walls and they have no chloroplasts. They're the only kingdom of living things where none of the members have cell walls. They are also always multicellular. Okay, and they are heterotrophs. Most animals will do cellular respiration, but with also having the ability to do fermentation. So we're going to talk about the difference between those two things later in the year. They all reproduce sexually. That's what animals do. The only one that I know of that doesn't is a hydra, which is a really small, simple animal that can actually reproduce by budding, but most of them are going to reproduce sexually. So examples of your animals, sponges are animals, worms, insects, and of course your different mammals. Their animal kingdom is one of the largest and most diverse of the kingdoms of living things. There's lots and lots of different kinds of animals, and then they can get classified down into simpler terms. Later. So it's hard to think of like us as mammals being related to worms or insects, but we are very much the same on the cellular level.